Good morning, YouTube. I was hoping that the internet was going to work well enough today because rural internet and you never know. Sweet. Well, happy Sunday. I have a really long list of questions today, and part of it is because there were some questions that I overlooked and missed. From the very first week, I had people tune in and they asked a lot of questions, and I completely forgot to copy and paste questions into my question list last week, and so then it never came back. So I was going through my comments last night to make sure that I wasn't missing any, and I was missing quite a few. So the list is pretty long today, but there's a lot of really good, interesting topics in here. But as always, if you have questions while you're watching this, and or there's something that I don't cover or you want me to elaborate on, feel free to drop your question in the chat. And if you are watching this at a later time, because I get it, not everybody can jump on a live right away as it's happening, just please drop your question in the comments, and I will usually I respond to the comment with my answer and then cover it on the next live Q&A in an extended version. So there's some things that it's difficult to write out, or it takes too long to write out, and I like to talk it out. Or if you are not comfortable dropping all of your situation in the comments, that's fine. You can send me an email, and it's just jiminycrickets@gmail. Jiminy Crickets, all one word. And I will respond to you via email, and then I will take out context and identifiers from your email and probably answer the question on the live for everybody to get the feedback and get the knowledge as well. So I will also start this with the same thing that I always say in the beginning of my videos, that I am not the cricket expert. I'm not the cricket guru. What I say is not 100% going to work for you because your situation is different. So please keep that in mind. Definitely, if you have any questions, your setup maybe is very, very different from mine, but the basics remain the same across most people's setups. So with that, I am going to start. My first four questions have quite a bit of context around them, so I'm just going to read them so that anybody who didn't ask the question kind of has an idea of where it's coming from. So this first question, I breed Turkestan cockroaches, which are rusty reds, I guess. I don't know anything about cockroaches or breeding cockroaches. I've heard they're kind of finicky, so good on you for raising them. And I decided to breed crickets also because my bird likes them a lot. So the rusty reds are very tenacious, and I assume, so this guy's from Russia, so some of these things translate one-to-one. I might replace some words, and if that's not what he meant, I'm trying. So the rusty reds are very tenacious of life, I assume hardy, and I was really surprised at the crickets. These punks like to die so much. Yes, crickets are finicky. I can find about 2 or 3 dead cockroaches a month, and I have about 1,500 of them now. But I can find about 10 dead crickets every day. Some of them are already mostly eaten, so I pull out just their heads. Okay. I have about 2,000 to 5,000 crickets now. I just don't know how to count this insane crowd. Fairly common question. Is it normal for crickets to die so much, or maybe I'm doing something wrong? Okay, so this is a really good question, but I have so many follow-up questions in terms of context of things that might be making your crickets die. I have no idea what age they're at, and so my recommendations would change based on age, kind of deal. And so there's so many things that could be going wrong. My guess, I have a hunch just based off of what you've said and the context that you've given me, but if you're finding the crickets that are mostly eaten, it looks like they're missing body parts and things like that, my guess is they don't have enough surface area or whatever you're feeding them doesn't have enough like animal protein in it. That's one thing about crickets is they are opportunistic omnivores is what I will call it. And they will get their animal protein wherever it's available. If you are not providing it for them, they're friendly little housemates there start to look really delicious. So my guess is you possibly don't have enough surface area for them to be happy and safe and really thrive. So I would first look at upping your surface area. So add things like egg cartons or cardboard, anything for them to crawl and hide on that just gives them a little more space so they're not eating each other. The second thing would be to check your feed source. So if you are feeding them some sort of a chicken feed, make sure that there is some sort of animal protein in there. Like I said, they need it. They will get it however they need to get it. And if it means eating their brother and sister, they will totally do it. The other big rock to look at, see what temperature they're at. You want to keep them, between 85 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit, so roughly 30 to 35 degrees Celsius. And then humidity-wise, 50%, 50 to 55% is usually pretty solid. If you end up going over that, you may have a gas exchange problem. One thing, if it's too humid and there's too much ammonia, that creates a sinking gas that is deadly and it will kill everything. It happens in all sorts of livestock barns. That's why you have to really monitor the air quality. So those are the big three things that I would check and see. Like I said, without a whole bunch of other context, like those are the three that I would guess are the issue right now. Okay. So second question from the same person. And again, I apologize for being so late on this. He dropped these comments in that first live and I just completely overlooked them. So sorry about that. You told in one of your videos you feed the crickets with chick starter. I bought it, but it's in granules, pretty hard ones, so it's very hard for the crickets to eat. Now I mill them in a blender, then sieve it. So I assume sieve is like sift. So now they eat this powder very gladly. Good. The problem is the process is pretty long. Perhaps you have any tips, or you have chick starter like flour in the US. I'm in Russia. I found just this one in granules. Okay, so there was a time when I was doing the same thing of I was buying the granules, so it was a layer feed. Most layer feeds are in crumbles or pellets, and interestingly, the reason that and I don't know if most people know this, but the history of like pelletizing feed for livestock is actually to keep insects out and to discourage insects eating the feed. So naturally, if it's pelletized, like that's not going to be ideal for your crickets. So a powder is better. They will eat the crumbles, but they don't eat it as well. So you are definitely correct in your observation of that. And so I used to like mill crumbles, that was a layer feed, into a finer powder, and it did work a lot better, but man, it was labor intense. So that was before I switched to the feeds that we're on right now. And the feeds that we're on right now do come in basically a coarse flour sort of consistency. So if you don't have that available to you, I would check into seeing what possible components that you can find that would be milled into that powder-like state first, that you can then mix yourself. If you can source the ingredients and do it that way, even if it costs you a bit extra to source the ingredients, like think of the labor time that you're saving. Time is money, labor is money. So if you can find something like that, find the source materials and mix them. So things like soybean meal, fish meal, or pork meat, ground oats, ground wheat, all sorts of ground grains, ground brewer's yeast, so spent brewer's yeast, things like that. The crickets will do well on. And it might, like I said, even if there's an increase in cost for your actual source ingredients, like you will save so much time, money, and effort not having to mill the stuff up. Otherwise, you just kind of got to get a bigger mill, which who knows if you can find one of those and it's cost effective. So that's the way I would look at it. So you're right in terms of powdered feed. It works way better. That's what we use. So if you can find it, go for it. If you can't, see what other alternatives you can find. Okay, third question from same individual, so this is pretty cool. I wanted to just try to breed them to see if I can do it. So I took about 30 crickets for breeding, but I did not expect so many offspring. So now I think if I freeze them in the freezer, how long will they stay good as food? 1 month, 3 months, a year? Do you know something about very long storage of frozen crickets? Excuse me while I drink some coffee because I can feel my voice being raspy already. Okay. So how long will they stay good for food in the freezer? I don't have a great answer for this because we don't keep them in the freezer super long. Generally speaking, like they are in and out of the freezer in a month max. Sometimes 2 if I'm trying to stagger some productions or things like that. But generally, we don't keep them in the freezer very long. Increasing shelf life in the freezer depends on what you're packaging it in. So if you are packaging it in things like if you're vacuum sealing it, it's going to have a longer shelf life than just a traditional plastic bag. The quality of the plastic, the barrier in between the freezer and the product, those are all the things that are going to make the difference. I would assume that you can probably keep them in the freezer like up to a year. Once we've dried them out, there is about a year shelf life, probably a little more, of the dried crickets. So technically, like if you leave them in the freezer, as long as they're well packaged and you're preventing freezer burn and things like that, you theoretically can keep them in the freezer for a year, dry them out, keep them on the shelf for another year plus. So you have 2 years or more. But again, that really, really depends on the packaging. Depends on the packaging when they're after they're dry, and it depends on the packaging as they're in the freezer as to how long those shelf lives are actually going to be. There's certain ways to extend it. You can extend the shelf life of the crickets on the shelf if you put like things like silica packets that absorb the oxygen and the moisture that might occur in there. All of these things help. Keeping the UV light out helps. There's all sorts of ways to extend shelf life, but frozen crickets and all of that, assuming you can keep the freezer burn away, you have a pretty long shelf life on those. So good question. And then fourth and final question from this same viewer, which thank you for these questions. These are really good. Another alternative for me in this situation is selling the surplus of crickets. And now I get another problem: how to count them. As I know, there are some keepers in my city who buy crickets, but it's always amount, not weight, which is typical. If you're selling into the live market to be sold as feeder crickets, typically those are done by number of crickets because that's the way you feed your lizard or your toad or things like that. So even if you're selling them wholesale or to somebody keeping them, like they know their lizard needs 25 crickets per week, they don't necessarily know that 25 crickets equals this amount of weight. So that's what's done in the live industry. So it makes total sense. Whereas what I do, it's by weight because food is by weight. Sorry. I'm not sure if you had the need to count the crickets. I don't, but I kind of know how to do it. But maybe you have tips or ideas. It would be appreciated. Cool. So first thing I will say about counting crickets, don't do it by weight. The weight can vary. For me, I don't care necessarily how many crickets are in my package of crickets. I mean, I do. I know it's usually between 90 and 100 crickets per half-ounce package by the time all is said and done with seasoning and all of that. But if it is, 95 crickets versus 120 crickets, doesn't really make a big impact on me. Your lizard, on the other hand, if they've had 25 crickets versus 35 crickets, they might know. But the interesting thing about weighing crickets at any stage of life, their hydration level and the humidity of their like growing chambers, their environment, whatever, has a massive impact on their weight. So it would not be uncommon for 5 crickets to, vary in weight drastically, or 10 crickets to vary in weight drastically, which makes weight not a reliable measure of actually counting. The way that most of the large commercial feeder cricket companies, farms, whatever you want to call them, do it is they actually measure count by volume. You're going to have to count them at some point to get a baseline, to get an average. So the way that I would do it, and the way that I did it for pinheads, just to figure out kind of per gram how many pinheads are in a gram on average. Again, like this varies wildly based on humidity, hydration, all of the things that make it difficult to measure. I froze a gram of crickets and I physically counted them. In that gram, there were roughly between 12 and 1,300 crickets. Tends to be a pretty good ballpark. But what the commercial guys do is they do it by volume. So they have a graduated cylinder and a funnel, and they have a mark where they know that 1,000 crickets, you get it to this level of volume, you have 1,000 crickets. How did they know this? They did the same thing. So they probably started, I don't know what they started with in terms of measurements, but like, let's just say that 1,000 crickets fits in a liter, 1,000 adult crickets fits in a liter. So maybe they took 250 milliliters of adult crickets, froze them, counted them, and then extrapolated that out to however many they need. So for example, whatever you find in 250 mils, multiply that by 4, that's what you're going to end up with in liters. Not going to be an exact science. Something like this with massive numbers is never going to be an exact science, but like you also don't have time to sit there and count out 1,000 crickets every time to make sure that it is totally correct. So if you have 1 or 2 extra, or you have 1 or 2 less, ideally, you do this a couple times so that you get a good average, you have something to work with. But that's the way I would do it. And that is at any age. So if you are going to be selling adult crickets only, then just do this for adult crickets. If you are going to be selling 2 weeks, 2/3, half, or 2 weeks, half growns, 2/3, and adults, you need to do that at every stage. It is very tedious, but you have to have some sort of baseline to figure out the average count at each of those age groups if that's what you're planning on selling. Because the worst thing, worst case, is you end up underselling and pissing a customer off because they didn't get the crickets that you charged them for, or you end up overselling and you're shooting yourself in the foot and you could be making more of a margin off of those crickets. So if you're going to go that route, there is some work that you need to do, but I would just take whatever measurement. Like I said, if you want to do 250 mils at each age group, throw them in the freezer, count them out. If you want to do that a couple times to get a little better estimation, a little better average, go for it. But that's how you count everything. That's how, like I said, most of the commercial farms, that's the way they do it. There is no avoiding the initial tedious phase of physically counting them. But if you can get some good numbers by volume, then it's just math at that point. So may not have been what you wanted to hear, but you are going to physically have to count them at some point. Obviously, so at least around us, anyone who buys directly from me, so like retail of crickets, I usually sell them to them by the dozen. Dozens are obviously easier to count, but even if you are, if you're getting up to 5-6 dozen, you don't want to count 60 or 72 crickets out, having some sort of a volumetric measure so that it gets you in the ballpark is a great idea. So that's how you do it. Okay, so question number 5. So thank you for those questions, by the way, my friend from Russia. I hope they were helpful, and I know that not everything we have over here would necessarily be available over there, but hopefully you can find something that works in the feed department and everything that way. Okay, so number 5, can you please explain how often you check your breeding trays and how to rotate them out once hatched? Has one bin filled with breeder trays all been laid in one day or a couple? Thank you. So this came up on when talking about incubators. So let me attack this question one at a time, because there's multiple different ones and I will forget where I'm at if I don't just answer one at a time. So please check how often you check your breeding trays, and start with that. How often do I check my breeding trays? So back up even before then, how long I leave my breeding trays in my grow out bins to be laid in, max 48 hours. 24 to 36 works well too, especially if you have high population densities. It actually might work better. But for labor reasons and things like that, I just leave it at 48. And generally, I may not always get into the cricket barn at the same time every day. So it may not be exactly 48. It might be a little under, it might be a little over. Truthfully, doesn't matter. Much of a muchness. You don't want to leave it in for longer than that, though, because the substrate tends to dry out. You're not touching it, especially if you have high population densities. Like, the moisture comes out of that one way or another. It just 48 hours is the max. So then once they've gone into the incubators, I probably check on them. So we spray them down after we take them out of the grow out bins. We put them in the incubators. I generally don't check on them for the first 3 or 4 days. I go and make sure that they are not dried out. Like, that is the number one thing, especially for the first 4, 5, 6 days. We incubate at the same temperature that we grow out, because I only have one room. So it's usually about 86 degrees. We do have the tops on them to keep the humidity in. There's a ventilation hole in the top, because if we don't do that, condensation is out of control. You end up with a really big problem in that if you don't have some sort of ventilation in your incubators. So once we hit the 5, 6 day mark, we then start to check them more often. You will notice a change in the way your eggs look as time progresses. When they're first laid, they are translucent. They're very tiny. Kind of hard to see if you don't know what you're looking for. They're shinier. Then as they progress, as time goes on, they get a milky white. They start to get bigger, as obviously the pinhead grows within the egg. And then it appears that they start to surface more. This is maybe me projecting onto them. I don't know if they actually do, or if this is just they grow and they are moving the peat moss. I don't know. You can see them as they start to get closer. So once I start to really notice them and see them, so this is probably 8 or 9 days in, I usually hatch at about 11 or 12 days. Like I said, given the conditions, if I had it warmer, they hatch faster. But so I check on them once it hits about 9 days. I make sure I check on them every day, every 24 hours, until they start hatching. Once they've started hatching, then you need to give them more attention. And that depends on how dense your eggs were. If they were really dense, you will have what I call super hatches, where you'll get the pinheads will carpet, meaning it's literally a layer of pinheads. You leave them carpeted too long and you are going to have massive die-off. So that's why I said, depending on how rapid your hatch is how often you're going to need to check it. I have one grower who is really, really, really good at hatching pinheads. And once he starts hatching, it's every 2 hours he's putting crickets in bins until his barn is full. So that is partly a feel thing, partly a density thing. It can be as often as every 2 hours once things have started hatching, or it can be, if you don't have super dense eggs, you can get away with once a day. Lots of ways to skin a cat on that one, and it depends, like I said, on your condition. Okay, second question. How do you rotate them out once hatched? So for me, generally speaking, my crickets hatch in a significant amount for the first 3 days. And then after that, they continue to hatch, but it's really not that plentiful, that fruitful. I don't really have a good word for it. I know what I'm trying to say, but it's not coming out. So you really only have the super hatch usually for about 24 hours within a bin. And and then they start to slow down, then you don't have to check that bin every 2 hours necessarily. Maybe you need to just do it twice a day to keep from carpeting. And then that tapers off as you go. Usually past day 3, I don't mess with that incubator much anymore. Not always the case, but once you start to see them slow down, you'll have some hatch, but they'll be incidental at that point. Has one bin filled with breeder trays all been laid in one day or a couple? This is a really good question. Really, really good question. And there are, again, many ways you can do it. For me, in terms of monitoring things and seeing where there's a problem and stuff like that, I only incubate breeding trays that have been laid within the same time period. So for one round, if we had the breeding trays in from, let's just use this month as an example. If we had them in from 11/9 to 11/11, all of the breeding trays in a particular incubator are only going to be from that 48 hours. That way, you can monitor, like I said, you can notice the difference as eggs are maturing and getting closer to hatching. They change in appearance. If you are mixing them all together, let's say that my 11/9s to 11/11s look really good, and I see that they are probably about 2 days away from hatching based on the way that they look. If I mix in from the next round, which would be 11/11 to 11/13, but something goes wrong, the peat moss is bad, I don't know, something goes wrong in the 11/11 to 11/13s, and they are not maturing, I have no way of noticing that when I mix them in with somebody else with a different time period. So I would suggest keeping them. The other thing, should you have any issues with things like drying out or too much condensation or any of the above, you don't want to be spraying down dried out breeding trays in the same bin as hatching breeding trays. You are going to kill your, possibly going to kill your pinheads that are hatching. You're possibly going to create a condensation problem because of the increased humidity, which is not a big deal except for when you have the baby crickets. Like, it just, keep them separate is the short answer to a long rambling. Keep them separate. Easier to keep track of problems. Easier to, it's just easier for everything. Keep them separate. If you are space constrained and you can't have a whole bunch of different incubators, fine. You can put them together. It's not the end of the world, but it's just a lot easier to keep track of things and make sure that what's hatching should be hatching and what isn't is not causing problems. All right, question number 6. We have a lot of stuff about incubation and hatching and breeding, which totally makes sense. I uploaded a really long video about breeding crickets last weekend that has gotten quite a few hours of watch time, so I know that people are watching it. So it's natural that that's where questions come up. And truthfully, since I've started this, that is where I get the most questions, is like incubation, breeding, babies, all of the things to grow your population. Sorry, stay on task here. Question number 6, your incubators stay in the same room as the rest of the population. I thought they needed more heat and humidity. So this is a really good question and a topic that I probably am going to do a video about possibly later today, more likely tomorrow, talking about incubation and hatching and all of the things in something like my setup. My ideal setup does have some form of hatchery, nursery, separate area, room conditions for incubation and pinheads. Not a reality of what I have available. My barn is what I have, and it is a single room. There's ways that I could modify it to make a pseudo room, but right now, what I've done so far works for me. I figured out a system that works for me. But should I construct anything new, you bet it will have a incubation chamber and hatchery, essentially. So you are correct in that optimally, your pinheads and your eggs, in terms of incubation, things like that, need to be warmer and more humid to an extent. There are ways around it, though, and because it's not warmer, that doesn't mean that my pinheads don't hatch, obviously. They just take a few days extra. If I had a dedicated incubation room, it would be at probably 91 or 92 degrees at all times, and we would have babies in 7 to 8 days max, possibly 6, depends. So higher temperature, assuming humidity and everything else is right, is going to result in babies faster. For me, not a big deal. As long as my babies are hatching predictably, I don't necessarily care about that extra day. I'm not in the live market, so I don't need to have multiple different generations. Not as big a deal for me. If you're in the live market, it makes a difference. So for me, it takes, like I said, 11 to 12 days generally to hatch at my 86 or 87 degrees. I manipulate the humidity to make sure that it's humid enough for the eggs and we don't have things drying out using a top on my containers. There is a limit to that in terms of the top. You don't want to have too much humidity. And if you think about it this way, in your incubator, you are putting a bunch of very moist substrate into a plastic container in a warm environment. Within that environment, essentially, you have constructed a microclimate. If you leave that without any sort of ventilation hole and any way for that humidity to escape, you're going to have a massive condensation problem. So you do need some sort of ventilation, or you need some sort of procedural thing where you take the top off on a daily basis to let things dry out. But you can successfully incubate crickets in a single room as the same conditions that the adults are living in. That's how it is for me right now, and that is how it is for me for the foreseeable future. That's how it is for all my growers. Like I said, we don't have any issues with getting pinheads to hatch. It's just that ours maybe take a little bit longer than if we had a dedicated hatching room, incubation room, that we could keep warmer than the adults. I hope that answers. Like I said, I'm going to end up doing another video on that one because I know that's not the norm necessarily, but I think for people starting up on a smaller scale that don't, have the luxury, the space, the anything to have a specific incubation chamber, I do want to elaborate and show people that you don't necessarily need to have a separate grow out chamber to make it work. So, new video on that one coming soon about incubating in the same space that you're growing, because it can be done. We do it repeatedly. Okay, number 7. And this one came from an email. There's 4 questions. 4 questions coming from, 3 questions coming from this email. So like I said before, if you are not comfortable dropping your questions in the comments, that's totally fine. Send me an email, jiminycrickets@gmail.com, and I will get back to you as soon as possible with a response. And then, like I said, I will take away name, identifying, all of that stuff, and do and do the next live. We'll cover the questions so I can elaborate a little bit because I don't like to write a ton. Okay, so number 7, can you reuse egg flats and housing? And there was, I seem to remember, but I didn't write it down, there was a little bit of an elaboration of, if I need to sanitize them, how do I do it? You can reuse egg flats and housing, assuming that you don't have any problems. You don't have any disease issues, you don't have any humidity problems, you don't have any mold problems, all of those things. They aren't absolutely chewed through by the females. Those are all things where I would say you're better off starting over. We reuse a lot of egg flats. We keep them in pretty good condition. Once they start to deteriorate, we throw them and we start over. It's a little bit of a judgment call. But if you want to sanitize them, you can. Do not do it chemically, ever. No chemical sanitization of anything in your barn. Personal view, don't do it. What may not be harmful to you from a sanitization level, using some sort of a chemical. So, give you an example. In my food processing facility, we use quaternary ammonia to sanitize. It comes in a concentrated jug, and then we dilute it out to what we need to be able to sanitize food safe surfaces. I can use that in my food, like for food safety, all of those things. The levels that the concentration is at kills 99 point whatever percent of bacteria, doesn't cause us as humans any issues. If there's any residue at that concentration level left over, will not cause any problems in food. All of those specifications that are going to kill that amount of bacteria and leave whatever it's going to leave in terms of residue are calculated for us as humans. That same concentration level, whether it be bleach, quaternary ammonia, whatever you would use as chemical sanitizer, the amount required to kill the bacteria is going to be a problem for your crickets, for residue left over, no matter what. Please don't sanitize with chemicals. If you're using sponges, do not use bleach to clean those sponges. You're never going to get it out. You're going to kill your crickets. Don't chemically sanitize anything. If you need to sanitize stuff, and when you sanitize stuff, use heat. So if you're going to use some sort of like a power washer or hot water, you can just get water that's 160 degrees, rinse everything out, let it dry, should take care of it. If you do want to sanitize your egg flats, housing, whatever, just in case, you can put it in the oven at low heat. Don't put it at high heat, you will start a fire, but you could put it in the oven at low heat, so 175 degrees, put it in there for a few minutes, should take care of everything. I suppose you could sanitize with UV light and things like that too. Please don't use chemicals. I hope I made that point. So you can reuse them, but when they start to get gross, just throw them out. They're cheap enough. Throw them out. Question number 8. How many crickets should I keep per container? Is there a magic formula? I wish there was a magic formula. There just is not. So this varies wildly depending on your setup, depending on your air quality, depending on what food you're feeding them, access to water, population densities. Some carrying capacities of some facilities are just not going to ever be as high as they are of others. Air quality reasons, like I said, you just don't have enough feed space. You don't have enough space in general, and that's okay. There is a metric that my friend Kevin Bachhuber came up with, and I don't know where he came up with it, but I'm glad he did, based on square footage of grow space. So like, say you're whatever your bin is, what is your grow space? What is your square footage of that bin? I'm talking only the bottom, not the sides, and you don't calculate this based on your projected grow space on your housing and things like that. A really good goal to try and hit is, he uses 0.6 as the 0.6 pounds, but I think 0.5 pounds makes for better math and close enough. If you can get to 0.5 pounds per square foot of growing space, that's a really good first goal. So 0.5 pounds of adult crickets per square foot grown. That's an awesome first goal. And then try and stretch it to a pound per square foot. If you get really, really good, you might be able to get in the 1.5 pound, but that would be optimal conditions, and you have to be the freaking cricket whisperer to get there. So that would be the closest to a magic formula that I have. Figure out your square footage per bin, and then I would suggest starting with half a pound per square foot. So if you have 2 square feet of grow space, you are shooting for a pound in that bin equivalent. And there's roughly 1,000 to 1,500 crickets per pound, depending. Like I said earlier, weight is not a reliable indicator, but it just gives you a ballpark to play in. So I know I don't really have a great answer for that, and not the answer that everybody wants of like, what's my formula? There is none. Okay, question number 9, and this one comes up a lot. He asked, how do I get into your grower program? Because I keep hearing you talk about these growers. Can I be one? And so, a few things. If you are in the state of Iowa, yes, you pass the first test of whether you can be my grower or not. I don't take on out-of-state growers. There's just too many things, too many reasons. Logistically, it's hard. Oversight, it's hard. Control, all of the things. Economic viability, like not suitable for out-of-state growers at this current juncture. That doesn't mean that we don't change that, we don't adapt later on, but right now, only in Iowa. Definitely don't do international growers. That would be like 17 steps ahead. Sorry, like that is a lot of things to have to juggle. So right now you have to be in Iowa. Prefer that you have an existing building. The example that I give usually to potential growers is like 1,000 square feet as a model. Doesn't have to be that big. I do not recommend going bigger than that, but we can have a conversation about it. So if you are in Iowa, you are interested, happy to chat. So that is the main qualifier, is you have to be in Iowa. So this person was not. So I'm sorry, but that's the main thing. But then, so as I should elaborate on what the process looks like. So you would reach out. I would probably get you up to my facility so you can actually see it in person. We would talk about what kind of availability you have, how crickets fit into your operation, your day-to-day, what your expectations are, that kind of thing. If it seems like it's a good fit, we'll continue to move forward. All of my growers have to go through a 1-day hands-on like cricket rearing course. So that you can get the hands-on experience. We can really chat more about what's going to work, what's not going to work, more expectations, those kind of things. You build out your facility, you get your insurance, all of those things put together. We'll get you a contract. And then once things are up and running and everything's signed off on the water, everything's signed off on your conditions, all of those things, I bring you some pinheads and I bring you some feed, and we're off and moving. Additionally, after you've gone through the cricket rearing course and we've got all the documentation we need, you will get, I have a cricket rearing manual, which is 45 pages, something like that. There's like all of links to a bunch of YouTube videos that are on this channel that you guys can watch, linked to certain procedures and things like that, so that we have them. And then obviously, as you're going through the build-up process and going through the actual growing process, you get 24-hour access to me and my knowledge of screw-ups of raising crickets. So that's the other thing. But like I said, right now, the major qualification is you have to be in Iowa. And so if you're not, sorry, can't do that yet. Maybe opportunities for franchises in different states down the road, but again, that's quite a ways away. So that's a little bit about the grower program. All right, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions left. I will fly through some of these, so it's not really going to take that long. And again, if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments. And if I don't get to them today, happy to get to them next week. Where's that? There we are. Okay, number 10. How does cricket words are hard. What does cricket powder taste like in a smoothie, and what else can you use it for? So I got this question yesterday. Crickets add kind of a malty, cricket powder adds kind of a malty flavor to your smoothie. I really like malts, so I like that flavor. If you don't like malted milk, or if you've never had a malt, you may have no reference to what that's like. So yeah, malty flavor is the best that I can explain it. And then what else can you use it for? You can bake with it. You can mix it in smoothies, mix it in sauces. The way I like to relate it to consumers these days is think of it like a high protein flax meal. You can mix it in just about everything, and it's not going to impact your flavor profile very much, or your texture profile very much. But it's never something that you're going to take a spoonful, throw it in your mouth, and be like, this is delicious. So usually most people have some sort of knowledge of flax meal, like I said, whether it is putting it in your smoothie, it's adding it to your cookies. So it's a good way to relate it to people. So you can use it for all sorts of things. Cricket powder is really, really diverse in the opportunities of what it can go into. So that's that one. Number 11, do you wholesale your crickets? So I'm going to split this into like 2 markets. Live, no. I do very, very little in the live market. The only times that I do the live market is retail, and that's very, very local, word of mouth. People who, there is a cricket shortage, so people do struggle to be able to feed their animals. I don't want that to happen. So I have very small amounts that I sell to the live market, and that's only retail. I don't know. I don't really want to structure my barn in a way that wholesale live makes sense. You would have to deliver multiple sizes to multiple places. It's just more logistics than I want to deal with. I don't have to, so I don't. Wholesaling in terms of the actual, like my products, I do. I wholesale quite a bit. I have brought on, since the beginning of 2021, I have brought on 74, 76, 70 something new wholesale accounts this year that wholesale my crickets. So if you have a specialty store, grocery store, gift shop, all sorts of things, if you want to wholesale my crickets, send me an email at jiminicrickets@gmail.com and I will get you all of the info. One caveat, I do only sell in the US. There's just too many other complicated things to try and get it across borders. So right now, only to stores in the US. But yes, I do have a wholesale program. Just send me an email if you are interested. Okay, number 12. Hi, Shelby. I have a few hundred crickets in a 5-gallon plastic pail. They're dying off for some reason. I'm using tap water for them to drink. Could this be a problem? Thanks. Okay, so this one, again, I need a lot of context that is missing. If you have it in a 5-gallon pail, what does the die-off look like? Is this like the previous question where they look like they're half eaten, then they're dying off, or are they like flat on their back with their belly up? And it looks like there's some sort of disease or other issue. Do you have housing? What are you feeding them? I know they're using the tap water to drink, so I'm glad he's got water in there. How high is humidity? What's your heat? Like all of those things would be a factor into why your crickets possibly could be dying. But I'm just going to go under the assumption on this one that he had everything else in order. It was just the water. Maybe that was the problem. So I asked a follow-up question, and this is the key question when you're looking at the water, is what is your water source? If you are sourcing from a municipal water source here in the US, so city water, rural water, anything not a well, essentially, that could be your problem. And the reason is that water is treated at a water treatment plant with chlorine. Typically chlorine and fluoride. I don't know if fluoride is a problem for crickets. I really have no idea on that one. I also don't know if fluoride, if you just leave it out, if it evaporates just like chlorine does. No idea. Anyways, I followed up with that question of are you on a municipal water source? And he said, yes, it's treated, it is treated with chlorine and fluoride. Like I said, the fluoride thing kind of threw a monkey wrench in my response because I'm not sure on that one. That's not something I've ever run into as a problem because we're on well water. But with what he said, my guess is that the water could be a problem. Easy, cheap way to fix this. You don't need to run out and go get like a reverse osmosis filtration system for your crickets, and that's like thousands of dollars. Don't need to do that. All you need to do is take your water out of the tap into a container. It can be whatever, a jar, a glass, whatever you're going to use. If he's only got a couple hundred crickets, put it in a cup, set it on your counter, let it sit there overnight. The exposure to the air, so basically water not in your pipes, is going to allow that chlorine gas to evaporate overnight and no longer be a problem. If you do that before you put it in with crickets, should eliminate the problem. So I followed up and told him, yes, that could very well be an issue. Here's why. And then he followed up with, can I use bottled water? Which is a really interesting possible solution. I think he said distilled water and bottled water. Can I use either of those? The star that I have on bottled water is that most bottled water here in the US is actually bottled at a municipal source. So even though it says Mountain Spring or I don't know, Mountain Spring is the first one I can think of, and that's usually the most of the marketing that goes into bottled water. Usually, though, that comes from like freaking Dallas Municipal Water or something like that. Pura Vida. All of these fancy things to try and upsell water that comes out of your tap. So you are still going to have chlorine in those. So, but same thing. If you wanted to do that, just dump it in a glass, let it sit, and then use it. Should hopefully take care of your problem on that one. Last question. Man, we go in themes on these questions. And this one actually wasn't by the same person. How do we water our crickets? If you haven't seen our videos on what our waterers look like and how we put them together and all of that, we use chicken waterers. Iowa is the largest producer of corn, soybeans, something else I'm forgetting, and eggs. So we have a lot of chickens. Although like the big commercial farms are not watered with like your traditional chicken waterer with a base and a quart jar. That they have automatic waterers. That's a whole different ballgame. Anyways, we water ours with it's a quart mason jar and a plastic bottom that goes with them. You can buy them at your local farm store. You can buy them off Amazon. You can find them online. It's plastic bottom. We use a glass top. You can buy the plastic tops as well. It's really up to you. It doesn't. Quart jars were cheaper, I thought, and you can find those secondhand if you really want. So the plastic bottom, we scuff that up with a coarse sandpaper so that the crickets have no issues getting up there. And then super, super key in the base. So you have your water on top. It's gravity fed, so it only goes to a certain level. We do pea gravel around the bottom of that. I know there's some people who do sponges, some people who do like rags or paper towels or things like that. The reason we do pea gravel is it's cheap and it's easy to clean. We make sure, one thing I will tell you, make sure that you have enough pea gravel in there when you put it in with pinheads that they're not going to drown and get themselves in trouble. But as they grow, you need to reduce the amount of pea gravel and essentially increase the amount of visible water that you see in the bottom of your waterer. If you don't put anything in the base, you will have drowned crickets upon drowned crickets upon drowned crickets. Crickets breathe out of their sides, things called spiracles, very easily overwhelmed in a very shallow amount of water that looks like they should be able to walk out of. They can't. So make sure there's plenty of things for them to crawl on. And yeah, so I have quite a few videos about how we water them. If you want to go check them out, I can do another one with a little more explanation. And actually, I might do another one of like your different options that you have, because obviously, again, mine is not the only way. We do what we do because it's cheap here in Central Iowa to be able to source those, and they're relatively easy to change. So I hope this was helpful. I will be back again next week, probably same time, same place, to do another one. If you do have any questions at all, like I said, either drop them in the comments here, and if you have questions as I'm talking, you can always drop those in there too, and I'm really happy to answer them. But if you have follow-up questions to anything I covered, please do say something, and then I will talk about it in the live, and if it warrants something with an extended conversation, or it's something that just keeps coming up for people, I will happily do a video expanding on it so you guys can have that as a reference. So yeah, thanks so much for you guys who have stuck with me and watched this whole time. And I'll be back again next week. It'll probably be, if my math is right, it'll be the 28th of November. We'll be post-Thanksgiving, and 8 a.m. Again, I think I like this time better because I have 9 orders to pack from the last 24 hours, and some of them I can't pack because I don't have enough inventory. So I need the rest of my day to be able to do some things. And I probably have babies hatching today. So it'll be a busy day. So I like to get this in early in the morning. So 8 a.m. November 28th. Submit your questions about raising bugs or eating bugs. I can do either. All right. For those of you here in the US, have a happy Thanksgiving. And I'll see you next week. Thanks, guys.